The rain tapped gently against the windshield as the yellow cab idled on the side of 6th Avenue, the city lights bleeding in long reflections across the wet pavement. Thomas adjusted the rearview mirror out of habit, though no one had been in the back seat for over an hour. The taxi smelled faintly of old leather, coffee, and time, things that clung to him the same way regret did. He was 72 years old, shoulders hunched from years of weight that had nothing to do with age. The war had left him with more than scars. It had left him with silence. Silence from the government, silence from his own family, and silence from the world that had long ago moved on. He had been gone too long. First in the jungle, then in the hospital, then in a kind of personal exile. By the time he made it back to the country, everything familiar had vanished. His wife had remarried, his daughter was gone, moved to another state, unreachable. No one had told her he was still alive. Maybe no one even knew. He hadn't tried hard enough. He couldn't. Instead, he drove. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, circling the city like a ghost in a yellow shell, picking up strangers and dropping them off at lives he never entered. He didn't need the money, he needed the motion, the distraction, the illusion of connection. On that particular Tuesday evening, the streets buzzed with after-work traffic, and umbrellas moved like ants on the sidewalks. His radio crackled with dispatcher chatter, but Thomas ignored it. He preferred to find fares on instinct. Something about that night felt different, though he couldn't say why. At exactly 6:17 p.m., a young man waved from the corner outside a bookstore, soaked from the rain, backpack slung over one shoulder. Thomas flicked on the meter and pulled over. The door opened with a metallic creak, and the man slid in, shaking water from his hood. "Thanks," he said, breathless. "Can you take me to Brooklyn Heights?" Thomas nodded, pulling into the street. The kid looked about 20, maybe 21. Dark, curly hair, sharp eyes. His voice had that fast, passionate rhythm of someone who felt too much and tried to say even more. As they drove through the rainy grid of Manhattan, the kid began talking. First about school. He was in college, studying history. Then about the city. How he hated the noise but loved the energy. Then, without prompt, he shifted to something else. "You know," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I've always wondered about people who disappear. Like, how do you just vanish from someone's life? I never met my grandfather. He went missing during the war, Vietnam. Presumed dead, I guess. But sometimes I think maybe he just didn't want to come back. Or couldn't." Thomas gripped the wheel a little tighter, the tires hissing through puddles. "They say he was a soldier. Quiet guy. My mom doesn't talk about him much. I think it hurt her too much. But I did some digging. Found out he used to play the trumpet. Crazy, right? A trumpet-playing soldier." Thomas said nothing, but his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The kid was staring out the window now, lost in thought. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this," he chuckled. "You probably get stories like this all the time." Thomas finally spoke, voice gravelly from disuse. "Not really," the kid smiled. "You remind me of him a little. What's your name?" Thomas hesitated. For years, he had used his middle name, just in case. "Tom. Tom," the kid repeated. "I'm Eric." There was silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with the unspoken. "I think he'd be about your age now," Eric continued. 72? 73? 72, Thomas answered softly. Eric nodded. "You ever serve?" Thomas nodded again, slower. "Vietnam." Eric leaned forward. "No kidding? You don't hear from many of you guys anymore." "We're around," Thomas said, "just quiet." The ride continued, winding across the bridge into Brooklyn, headlights streaking through the rain. Eric talked about a project he was working on, a family history paper. He had been trying to trace his grandfather's path through the war. "You ever heard of a guy named Thomas Kessler?" Eric asked suddenly. "He was in the 25th Infantry Division. Disappeared in 73. Thomas's heart stuttered. "Why?" "That's my grandfather," Eric said. "Or was. I found his military records. But after 73, it's like he never existed." Thomas felt the name echo in the cab, like a ricochet. It had been years since he'd heard it aloud. You ever wonder, Eric continued, if people just choose to stay gone? Like, maybe it's easier than facing what they left behind? Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't. The words sat heavy in the air, pressing into the space between them. The cab slowed near a row of old brownstones. Here's good, Eric said. Thanks again, Tom. He handed over cash and opened the door, pausing halfway. Hey, weird question. You ever play trumpet? Thomas's eyes met his in the mirror. Long time ago. Eric smiled again, almost nervously. You should pick it up again. I bet you were good. Then he was gone, stepping into the drizzle, disappearing up the stone steps of a building Thomas had never seen, but now felt chained to. The door closed. Thomas sat there, engine idling, heart pounding in rhythms he hadn't felt in decades. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a battered photo, black and white, edges curled, stained by time. A young man in uniform holding a baby girl, his daughter, Eric's mother. The truth burned in his chest like a flare. He was alive. His grandson had just sat in his back seat and told him his own life story. And he had said nothing. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. And now, the chance had passed. Or had it? The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof of the cab as Thomas sat alone, gripping the photograph and wondering how many more rides he could take before he found the courage to go back. Not to the war, not to the past, but to the people who still lived in its shadow. The rain had slowed to a misty drizzle by the time Thomas pulled away from the curb, his knuckles pale against the steering wheel, the photograph now resting on the dashboard, like a wound turned outward. He drove in silence, weaving through the streets of Brooklyn without thought or destination, the echo of Eric's voice lingering in his ears like distant thunder. He couldn't shake it, those words, so casual and unassuming, but laced with meaning. You remind me of him a little. As if blood recognized blood, Thomas had spent years convincing himself that staying gone was the merciful thing, that returning would only reopen scars, better left buried. But now, he'd looked his grandson in the eyes and said nothing. The guilt hit him harder than any bullet ever had. He drove aimlessly for hours, circling blocks, barely registering the fares he picked up, automatic responses spilling from his mouth like static from an old radio. Each moment alone in the cab felt more unbearable than the last. By midnight, he pulled into a deserted parking lot behind an all-night diner, shut off the engine, and sat there beneath the orange glow of a flickering light post. He took the photo in his hands again, running his fingers along the creases. He remembered taking it, barely 25, cradling his infant daughter while his wife stood just out of frame, laughing softly. A simpler moment before the draft letter arrived, before the long silence that followed. He had written to them from overseas hundreds of pages, but most never made it. And when the ambush came and he was captured, held for years in a makeshift jungle prison, with no hope, no contact, no certainty he'd live to see another sunrise, he'd imagined this exact scenario. That if he ever made it back, the world would be gone without him. He never imagined he'd live to see a part of it, walk into his cab and call him a stranger. The next morning, he clocked in early, waiting near Columbia University, hoping lightning might strike twice. He scanned every corner, every bookstore, every kid with a backpack and curly hair. But Eric didn't appear. Days passed, then a week, then two. The city kept moving, indifferent to his vigil. Eventually, Thomas forced himself to give up the search, but the guilt remained lodged beneath his ribs, like shrapnel. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, he stopped at a small music store, on a side street he hadn't visited in years. Inside, it smelled of wood polish and old ambition. He walked past rows of guitars and violins until he reached the dusty brass section. His eyes settled on a trumpet, not unlike the one he had played as a teenager. Without thinking, he bought it. The clerk, a quiet woman with gray streaks in her hair, gave him a knowing smile as she wrapped it. That night, in the solitude of his tiny apartment above a bakery, he unpacked it. His hands trembled as he lifted the horn to his lips for the first time in over 40 years. The first note was cracked and breathless, but the second wasn't. And soon, the room filled with sound. Not perfect, but alive. The next day, he did something reckless. He took the trumpet with him to work, storing it in the trunk of the cab, just in case. He didn't know what just in case meant until 2 nights later when he saw him again. Eric, standing on the same corner, drenched in the same kind of rain. Thomas's heart nearly stopped. He pulled over. Eric slid into the back seat, clearly not recognizing the driver. "Brooklyn Heights again," he said. "Rough day," Thomas offered cautiously. Eric sighed. "Yeah, been hitting a wall with this family paper I'm working on. I thought I was onto something about my grandfather, but the trail just vanished." Thomas said nothing, his throat suddenly dry. "There's this theory I read," Eric continued, rubbing his temple, "that sometimes trauma erases people. Not just from records, but from memory. Like people forget you existed because it's easier." Thomas gripped the wheel tighter. "You think that's what happened to your grandfather?" "I don't know," Eric said. I wish I could talk to him. Even just once. Ask him why." The cab turned onto a quieter street. Thomas's mind raced. This was his chance, but he had no idea what to say. If he blurted it out, would Eric believe him? Would it help? Would it only hurt more? He glanced in the mirror. Eric was staring out the window, a figure of quiet ache. The car slowed as they approached the destination. Before Eric could open the door, Thomas turned slightly and said, "Wait, I have something for you." Eric blinked, confused. "What?" Thomas reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the photo. His hand shook as he passed it back. "Take a look." Eric studied it, eyebrows furrowing. This is my mom. That's her as a baby." He looked up, eyes wide. "Where did you get this?" Thomas met his gaze, steady and raw. "I'm Thomas Kessler." The silence that followed was unbearable. Eric stared at him, the photo trembling in his hands. "Number, that's not possible. You're dead." "I was lost, not dead, captured. For years. By the time I came back, your mother was gone. I didn't know how to reach her. I didn't know if I even should." Eric shook his head slowly, as if trying to wake from a dream. "Why didn't you say something the first time?" "Because I was a coward," Thomas said quietly. "Because I didn't want to ruin the image you had. I heard how you talked about me, about the mystery. I didn't want to disappoint you with the truth." Eric looked back down at the photo. His face was a storm of emotions: disbelief, anger, sorrow, wonder. You really played the trumpet?" "Still do," Thomas said. "I brought it with me tonight. It's in the trunk." Eric let out a shaky breath, tears glistening in his eyes. "This is insane." "I know," Thomas said, "but it's real." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the ticking of the meter, counting seconds like heartbeats. Finally, Eric whispered, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Thomas replied. "I just wanted you to know I'm here, and that I never stopped thinking about your mother, or you." Eric opened the door but paused. He turned back, still gripping the photo. "You'll be back here tomorrow night?" Thomas nodded. "Same time." Eric stepped out into the rain and disappeared up the stairs. This time, Thomas didn't drive away. He waited, eyes on the building, trumpet still in the trunk, heart playing a melody he hadn't dared hope to hear again. The next day felt like a lifetime. Thomas didn't take any passengers. He drove slowly, aimlessly through the city, unsure if he was preparing for something or escaping it. Every red light felt longer than the last, every honk and siren more distant, like the city was tuning out just as he was tuning in. He had lived decades behind a mask, first survival, then shame, then quiet routine. But now there was a crack in it, and through that crack came something he had not allowed himself to feel in years: hope. When the evening came and the sky dimmed into a soft blue haze, Thomas returned to the corner near the bookstore, the same place where Eric had first waved him down. He parked across the street and waited. The trumpet case sat beside him on the passenger seat, its weight more symbolic than physical. Time dragged. He checked his watch every few minutes, though he already knew what time it was. When 6:17 came and went, his heart sank slightly, but he remained. 30 minutes later, a silhouette appeared across the intersection. Eric. He walked slowly this time, not rushing through rain, but moving like someone who had made a decision. Thomas got out of the cab. They stood across from each other, the street between them, the noise of the city reduced to background hum. When the light changed, Eric crossed. No words at first, just a nod, a long look. Then, quietly, I wasn't sure if you'd come. Thomas smiled faintly. I wasn't sure if you would either. Eric glanced at the trumpet case in the front seat. Is that it? Thomas nodded. Yeah, it's not much, but it still plays. Will you play something? Thomas hesitated, then opened the trunk and carefully removed the case. He stepped onto the sidewalk and lifted the trumpet, positioning it under the glow of a street lamp. He didn't know what to play at first. Then instinct took over. He played something soft, something old, a jazz lullaby he used to hum to his daughter when she couldn't sleep. The melody floated gently through the air, dancing around car horns and distant subway rumbles. Eric stood motionless, eyes wide, listening not just to the music but to everything it meant. When the last note faded, there was a long silence. Then Eric said, My mom used to hum that tune when I was a kid. Said she heard it from her dad once when she was little. Thomas swallowed hard. She remembered it? She never forgot it, Eric said. Even when she stopped talking about you, that tune stayed. They sat in the cab together afterward, not driving, just talking. Eric asked questions. Thomas answered all of them. The war, the capture, the failed attempts to reconnect, the guilt that kept him away. Eric listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with quiet tears. She thought you died hating her, Eric admitted. She always wondered if she had done something wrong, that you didn't try to come back because of her. Thomas closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. Number God, no. I thought about her every day. I didn't know how to reach her. And then I got scared. I let too much time pass. Eric nodded slowly. She lives in Vermont now. Teaches art at a community college. She still paints. Thomas blinked. The thought of his daughter alive, creating beauty, striking something deep inside him. Do you think, would she want to see me? Eric didn't answer right away. I don't know, but I think she deserves the choice. A few days later, Thomas stood outside a small brick building with ivy crawling up the sides and a wooden sign that read, Mason College Art Wing. The fall leaves crunched under his shoes as he waited, trumpet case in hand, nerves fraying his every breath. Eric stood beside him, both of them watching the door. When it opened, a woman in her late 40s stepped out. She had his eyes. Her hair was streaked with gray, tied back loosely. She was holding a sketchbook and laughing at something a student had just said. Then she saw them. She froze. Her smile faltered. Her eyes locked on Thomas. The world seemed still. She walked forward slowly, unsure, as if afraid she might be dreaming. Dad? She said, barely louder than a whisper. Thomas felt his knees weaken. He nodded, tears already brimming. I'm here, he said. I never stopped wanting to be. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she touched his face. You're real, she breathed. You're really here. And then she embraced him, not tightly, not angrily, but carefully, like holding something fragile and sacred. Thomas closed his eyes and held her back. Behind them, Eric watched in silence, his heart full and breaking all at once. Later, they sat on a bench under a tall oak tree near the parking lot. They talked for hours, about the lost years, about her childhood, about the things they wished they could have. Shared. There were no accusations, only truths. There was no judgment, only time that had been both cruel and forgiving. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Eric asked, So, what now? Thomas looked at his daughter. That's up to her. She smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. You're coming home with us. Just for a while. We'll figure it out. Thomas nodded slowly. For the first time in decades, he felt something settle in his chest. Peace. Not complete, but enough. The next morning, the taxi sat parked in the garage. The keys hung neatly on a hook. On the dashboard rested the trumpet case, closed, polished, ready for new music. And for the first time in a very long time, Thomas Kessler went home